The plasma round took Sergeant Marin Cade in the left shoulder and spun her into the barricade wall, and the only thought she had as the ceramic plating cracked away from her collarbone was that the Vethrani had finally learned to aim low. She hit the ground hard. Dust coughed up around her in a dry orange cloud, gritty against the exposed skin where the armor had peeled. The battlefield behind the wall was a bright, sunlit ruin of what had once been the Vethrani colonial outpost at Dresh-Ka, and the mid-morning light caught the smoke columns in long pale streaks that made them look almost peaceful from a distance. They were not peaceful. Nothing on this rock had been peaceful for 11 days. Cade rolled to her side and pressed her right palm flat against the wound. The shoulder screamed, but the bone was intact. She could feel it, solid under the char. She had been shot worse. She had been shot worse on this deployment alone. "Sergeant's down," someone said over the close channel. "Private Len, probably." The kid had a habit of narrating the obvious. "Sergeant's up," Cade said, and pushed herself into a crouch behind the wall. She flexed the fingers of her left hand. They moved. Good enough. 40 meters across the rubble field, a Vethrani position coughed suppressive fire in bright green arcs that chewed into the barricade's upper lip and sent chips of alien masonry raining down on her helmet. The Vethrani were big-scaled and built for endurance, their bodies a mottled teal and brown, the color of creek stones, and they fought the way their physiology suggested they would: heavy, sustained, grinding. They did not adapt quickly. They did not need to. They simply did not stop. But they had never fought a human for 11 days straight before. Cade thumbed a fresh cell into her sidearm and checked the charge indicator with a glance. 80%. She had 4 more cells on her belt, 2 fragmentation charges in her thigh pouch, and a field knife she had resharpened twice since landing. That was the inventory. Resupply was not coming. Resupply had not been coming since day 4, when the Vethrani interdiction screen had locked down the orbital corridor so tight that even a drone couldn't slip through without being swatted into scrap. It didn't matter. 11 days and she was still here. "Volkov, what's left of 2nd Squad?" she asked. Corporal Volkov's voice came back clipped and flat, the way it always did when the numbers were bad. "Me, Hassari, and the new one. Drenik caught a beam at 340. Didn't make it." 4 soldiers in 2nd Squad, 3 in her own, counting herself. 7 humans holding a position designed for 40. Cade didn't comment on the math. The math had stopped being useful around day 6. "We're pushing the right flank," she said. "Len, you're on suppression. Volkov, take Hassari wide through the drainage channel and hit their barricade from the south face. I'll go center." A brief silence on the channel. Nobody asked why the center, the most exposed approach, the one with the least cover and the most direct line of fire from the Vethrani hardpoint. Nobody needed to ask. They knew Cade walked into the kill lane the same way she had walked into it on day 1 and day 3 and day 7. The Vethrani kept expecting her to stop doing it. She kept not stopping. "Moving," Volkov said. Cade waited for Len's suppression burst to rake across the Vethrani position, watched the green return fire stutter and shift, and then she was up and running. The rubble field was a shattered mess of alien architecture, huge blocks of pale stone that had been elegant once, carved with Vethrani script that meant nothing to her except as cover. She moved between them in a low sprint, her boots crunching on pulverized masonry, her damaged shoulder sending a bright wire of pain up her neck with every stride. She ignored it. Pain was information, and the information was, the shoulder works, keep moving. A Vethrani gunner saw her. The plasma bolts tracked toward her in a converging fan, green and hot, and she cut left behind a fallen column, let the bolts chew into the stone, and came out the other side already firing. Her sidearm barked twice. The gunner's torso armor cracked on the first shot, and he staggered. The second took him in the gap between his neck plates, and he dropped. She didn't slow down. The Vethrani had held Dresh-Ka's eastern compound for 6 days now, a fortified position built into the remains of their own administrative center. They dug in with the kind of stolid patience. Their species was famous for overlapping fields of fire, reinforced walls, enough ration stock to wait out a siege. They had numbers. They had heavier weapons. They had a supply line that still functioned, even if it was stretched. What they did not have was any idea what to do about the 7 humans who refused to leave. Cade had heard their comms chatter through the translator module. The Vethrani officers spoke about the human squad with a tone she recognized from years of fighting across 4 different species' territories. Confusion that was beginning to curdle into something colder. The word they kept using translated roughly as aberration. They used it the way a doctor might use the word for a disease that did not respond to treatment. She reached the forward edge of the rubble field and dropped to a knee behind a chunk of wall that gave her a clear line on the Vethrani barricade. The hardpoint was a half-circle of stacked stone and composite plating, manned by 6 Vethrani soldiers who stood a head and a half taller than her and outmassed her by at least 60 kilos each. They wore the teal-and-brown combat harnesses of their colonial garrison, and their weapons were the big, crew-served plasma projectors that fired bolts fat enough to punch through vehicle armor. Cade looked at them and she counted. 6 soldiers, 3 weapon emplacements, 1 weak point, the junction where the composite plating met the original masonry wall, a gap just wide enough to thread a fragmentation charge through if you were close enough and steady enough, and didn't mind the fact that getting close enough meant crossing 8 meters of open ground under direct fire. She did not mind. But timing mattered. She keyed the channel. Volkov, you in position. 30 seconds. She waited, not nervously. Not with the coiled spring tension that the Vethrani expected from a trapped enemy. She waited the way she had waited at the rifle range back on Ridgeline Station, years ago when the targets were paper and the stakes were a training score. Patient. Level. The shoulder throbbed and she let it throb. The Vethrani officer at the barricade, she could tell rank by the silver threading on his harness, was scanning the rubble field through a scope device mounted on his forearm. He was looking for her. He knew a human had moved into the field. He did not know where she was now, and Cade could see the way his crest, the stiff, fin-like ridge that ran from his brow to the back of his skull, was flat against his head. In Vethrani body language, that meant unease. Not fear, not yet. But the beginning of the understanding that something was not right. In position, Volkov said. Hit them. The south face of the barricade erupted. Hassari's marksman rifle cracked twice, sharp and clean, and a Vethrani soldier on the left flank pitched sideways. Volkov's automatic weapon opened up a half-second later, raking the composite plating with kinetic rounds that didn't penetrate but made a sound like hammers on a drum, and the Vethrani crews pivoted to face the new threat. Cade stood up and ran. 8 meters, open ground. She covered it in 6 strides, her legs driving hard, her good arm pulling the fragmentation charge from her thigh pouch and thumbing the 3-second primer. The Vethrani officer saw her coming. She watched his crest snap upright, alarm, genuine alarm, and his mouth opened to shout a command. But she was already at the gap, already shoving the charge through the junction between plating and stone, already throwing herself flat on the other side. The detonation was sharp and contained, exactly what a fragmentation charge was designed for. The plating buckled inward and the 2 Vethrani soldiers closest to the junction went down, one silent, one screaming. The officer stumbled back, his left arm hanging at an angle that meant the bone had caught shrapnel. Cade came over the barricade low, her sidearm up, and put 2 rounds into the first standing soldier before he could bring his weapon around. The second swung a combat blade, a thick, curved thing that the Vethrani used for close-quarters work, and Cade stepped inside the arc, caught his wrist with her left hand despite the scream from her shoulder, and drove her right elbow into the nerve cluster under his jaw. He went limp. She let him fall. The officer faced her. He was wounded, his arm useless, and he had drawn a sidearm of his own but hadn't raised it. He was staring at her. Cade stared back. She wasn't breathing hard. 11 days of this, and her body had reached the point where combat was just another state of being, no different from sleep or eating or staring at the wall during the brief intervals between engagements when nothing was trying to kill her. She had crossed past fatigue into something that wasn't adrenaline, wasn't willpower, wasn't the desperate survival instinct that the Vethrani's xenobiology manual said should have failed by day 3. It was something else, something that the manuals didn't have a word for, because the manuals had been written by species who had never met a human. The officer said something. The translator in her earpiece caught it a beat later. "You should be dead by now." Cade looked at him. "Yeah," she said, "I get that a lot." She disarmed him, took his sidearm, ejected its cell, tossed it aside, zip-tied his wrists with a strip of composite fiber from her kit. She was not cruel about it, but she was not gentle either. She was efficient, the way she was efficient about everything now, the way exhaustion had burned away every unnecessary motion until what was left was a machine made of bone and training, and the kind of stubbornness that did not have a biological name. "Barricade secure," she said into the channel. 6 down, 1 prisoner, push up." They pushed up. The next 200 meters were a grinding advance through Vethrani defensive infrastructure that had been designed by engineers who understood siege warfare at an instinctive, species-deep level. The Vethrani had evolved on a world of territorial megafauna, and their military architecture reflected it: layered barriers, interlocking sight lines, kill zones that channeled attackers into prepared positions. Every 50 meters, another barrier. Every barrier, another set of defenders who had been listening to the fighting at the previous position and had time to prepare. Cade's squad took them one at a time. The second barrier fell to Volkov and Hassari's flanking maneuver through a drainage ditch that ran along the compound's southern perimeter. Volkov pinned the 3 defenders with sustained fire, while Hassari worked her way around to a blind spot created by a collapsed section of wall, then dropped 2 of them with precise shots from her marksman rifle before they registered her position. The third surrendered when he saw Cade coming through the barrier opening with her sidearm up and her face carrying the expression that the Vethrani had started calling, she would learn this later, from intercepted communications: the absence. Not rage, not determination, just a void where those emotions should have been, filled instead with a cold operational focus that their species found more unsettling than any display of aggression. The third barrier was unmanned. The Vethrani who had been assigned to it had fallen back to the fourth after watching the second position fall in under 90 seconds. Cade noted this with the part of her mind that tracked enemy morale the way other soldiers tracked ammunition. The defenders were beginning to pull back before contact. That was significant. The Vethrani were not a species that retreated easily, and the fact that they were giving ground before the fighting even started meant that the calculus in their heads had shifted. They were no longer defending territory. They were managing fear. The fourth barrier was the last before the main building, and it was the hardest. 8 defenders, 2 heavy emitters, and a clear field of fire that covered 30 meters of approach. Cade studied it from behind the third barrier's wall and ran the math. 8 defenders was too many for a direct assault. The heavy emitters could chew through their cover in seconds. The approach offered no defilade, no dead ground, nothing to break the line of sight between the emitters and the advance. "Len, bring that projector up." Len arrived, sweating, the massive Vethrani weapon slung across his back like a piece of industrial equipment. He was a compact man with the kind of wiry endurance that came from growing up on a heavy-gravity mining colony, and he handled the projector with a matter-of-fact competence that suggested he'd forgotten it wasn't designed for his species. "Set it here. On my mark, put everything into the right side emitter. The crew will duck or die. Either way, their right flank goes quiet for 5 seconds. 5 seconds isn't much. 5 seconds is plenty. It was. Len's projector barked once, a single sustained burst that lasted exactly 5 seconds, and turned the right side emplacement into a fountain of molten composite and shattered stone. The crew dove for cover. In those 5 seconds, Cade, Volkov, and Torsen covered the 30 meters at a dead sprint, reached the barrier, and went over it. The Vethrani had deployed their garrison in a layered defense, each position feeding into the next, and the doctrine was sound. Against any force of equivalent size and technology, the eastern compound would have held for months. Against a larger force, it would have held for weeks. The Vethrani were not poor soldiers. They were disciplined, well supplied, and they did not rout easily. But they had built their doctrine around assumptions, and the assumptions were wrong. Assumption 1. A force of 7 soldiers, cut off from resupply, would conserve resources and fall back to a defensible position. Cade's squad had done the opposite. They had attacked, every day, sometimes twice. They attacked when they were wounded. They attacked when they were out of ammunition for their primary weapons and had to scavenge Vethrani cells to keep their sidearms fed. They attacked when the Vethrani expected them to sleep. Assumption 2. A species of that size, with that metabolic rate, would degrade rapidly under sustained combat stress. The Vethrani's own xenobiology models predicted that humans would lose effective combat function within 72 hours of continuous engagement, based on body mass, caloric intake requirements, and observed sleep deprivation curves from their initial encounters with human populations. The models were extrapolated from their experience with 9 other species. Every one of those species had degraded on schedule. Humans did not degrade on schedule. Cade knew this, not because anyone had told her, but because she lived it. She had not slept more than 90 minutes at a stretch in 11 days. She had eaten twice today a Vethrani field ration that tasted like wet chalk, and a strip of dried protein from her own kit that she had been saving since day 9. She had been shot twice, cut once, and had a bruise across her ribs that she was fairly sure involved a hairline fracture, and she was still moving. Not because she was special, not because she was engineered or augmented or the product of some secret program. Because she was human, and humans were built on a world where the things that hunted you did not stop hunting you because you were tired, and so you evolved to not stop either. The Vethrani were beginning to understand this. She could see it in the way they fought now, not with the grinding confidence of the first 3 days, but with something closer to wariness. They took shots at longer range. They fell back sooner. Their crest displays, which had been aggressive and upright during the initial engagements, were flatter now, pressed closer to the skull. The body language of prey recognizing a predator. But the compound was deep, and there were more of them. Cade's squad reformed at the captured barricade. Volkov and Hassari came in from the south, both dirty, both intact. Len arrived from the suppression position carrying a Vethrani plasma projector he'd scavenged from a dead gunner, the weapon almost comically large in his human-sized hands. The new one, Private Torsen, who had been in theater for exactly 13 days and had never served outside the Sol system before this deployment, brought up the rear, moving with the careful, wide-eyed alertness of someone who was still calibrating to the fact that everything he had learned in training was insufficient preparation for this. "What's the count ahead?" Cade asked, reloading her sidearm with a fresh cell. "Thermal says 20+ in the central building," Hassari said. She was a wiry woman with a shaved head and a talent for electronics that she mostly used to keep the squad's helmet sensors functional beyond their rated lifespan. "They've got the big emitters on the second level, overlapping coverage on every approach. Tunnels. One runs under the east wing. I'm reading 4 contacts down there. Could be a ready reserve or could be a supply detail. 20+ entrenched soldiers with heavy weapons, fortified in a structure that had been designed as a government building, and subsequently hardened with military-grade composite. 7 humans with small arms, 1 scavenged plasma projector, and whatever the new private was carrying in his pack. Cade studied the building. It was an ugly thing now, pitted with blast marks and missing most of its upper facade, but the core structure was solid. The Vethrani had engineered their colonial architecture to withstand the seasonal storm systems on Dresh-Ka, which meant thick walls, deep foundations, and load-bearing columns that would absorb kinetic rounds without structural compromise. A straight assault through the front approaches would be a killing field. She wasn't going through the front. Volkov, Hasari, you're taking the tunnel. Clear the 4 contacts, then find me a way up into the east wing from below. There'll be maintenance access, drainage risers, something. These buildings always have utility paths. Volkov nodded. He didn't ask how she knew about Vethrani building construction. 11 days of fighting through their infrastructure had taught the squad more about Vethrani engineering than any briefing packet. Len, you and Torsen set up with the scavenged projector here. When I give the signal, put sustained fire on the second-level emitters. You won't penetrate, but you'll make them duck. That's all I need. Len looked at the projector. How long can I sustain fire? With that cell, maybe 40 seconds. And after 40 seconds, you improvise. Len didn't smile. None of them smiled anymore, not because morale was broken, but because the muscles involved had stopped receiving priority. He just nodded and started positioning the projector against the barricade for stability. Cade looked at the building again. There was a service path along the west face, a narrow alley between the main structure and a secondary building that had partially collapsed on day 2. It was tight, maybe a meter wide, and it was exposed to fire from the second-level emplacements for about 6 meters before it reached the cover of the collapsed section. 6 meters. She measured it against the Vethrani's reaction time. Their species had excellent vision and good reflexes by galactic standards, but their target acquisition cycle for a moving object ran approximately 1.4 seconds from detection to aimed fire. At a dead sprint, 6 meters took her about 3 seconds. That meant she'd be under aimed fire for roughly 1.6 seconds. She'd had worse odds. Moving in 5 minutes, she said. Channel stays open. If you hear me say collapse, Volkov, blow whatever structural support you're near. We bring the building down on top of them. That would bring it down on top of you too, Torsen said. Cade looked at him. The new private had an earnest face beneath the grime, and his eyes held the particular blend of horror and respect that she had seen in every replacement who had lasted more than 48 hours. He hadn't realized yet that the calculus was simple. The mission was the line. Everything else was arithmetic. Yeah, she said, it would. She didn't explain further. She didn't need to. Torsen would either understand it in time or he wouldn't be here long enough for it to matter. 5 minutes. Cade used 3 of them to check her equipment. Sidearm charged, blade sharp, fragmentation charge primed. She used the remaining 2 minutes to sit against the barricade wall and close her eyes. Not sleeping. Resting the way a human rests, not shutting down. Not entering a dormant state, but reducing output to the minimum necessary for the body to catch a breath. The Vethrani did not do this. They slept deeply or they were fully active. There was no middle state. Humans lived in the middle state. It was, perhaps, the single most important thing about them. When she opened her eyes, the 5 minutes were up. She moved. The west alley was exactly as narrow as she'd estimated. She entered it at a sprint, her wounded shoulder scraping the wall on the left side, and the second-level emplacements opened up the moment the Vethrani gunners registered her motion. Green bolts slashed down into the alley behind her, chewing stone, and she felt the heat of a near miss on the back of her neck as she cleared the 6-meter gap and reached the cover of the collapsed section. She didn't stop. The collapsed building had created a jumble of broken stone and bent structural members that formed a rough ramp up to the second level of the main building. She climbed it fast, using her hands and knees, ignoring the protest from her shoulder, and came out on a ledge that overlooked the interior of the central hall. She saw them. 22 Vethrani soldiers. They were arranged in a defensive formation around the hall's central platform, a raised dais that had probably served as a ceremonial stage or a court of law before the war had turned it into a command post. Their officer, a tall specimen with silver-threaded harness and a crest that rose high and stiff with authority, stood at the center, directing fire teams through a handheld comm unit. The big plasma emitters were positioned at the hall's second-level galleries, 4 of them, each crewed by 3 soldiers who were pouring fire out through the building's shattered windows at the barricade where Len and Torsen were setting up. Cade counted weapons, positions, sight lines. She had 1 fragmentation charge left, a sidearm with 3 cells, and her knife. 22 soldiers, all armed, all alert. She keyed the channel, Volkov status. In the tunnel, 2 contacts down, moving on the 3rd. When you're through, find that utility path. I need you in the east wing in 3 minutes. Copy. She keyed Len, open up. The scavenged plasma projector roared. Even from inside the building, the sound was enormous, a sustained crackling howl that hammered the second-level galleries and sent the Vethrani gun crews diving for cover. The emitters went silent, one by one, as the operators scrambled to reposition behind their own plating. Cade dropped from the ledge. She landed on the gallery floor of the second level, 8 feet below the ledge, and the impact sent a shock through her injured shoulder that whited out her vision for a half-second. She didn't pause. The nearest gun crew was 3 meters to her right, 3 Vethrani soldiers tangled behind their emplacement, trying to bring the emitter around to face the new fire from outside. She shot the first one in the back of the knee, where the armor gapped at the joint. He went down. The second spun toward her, and she put a round through his faceplate before his weapon came up. The third was faster, a veteran. She could tell by the scoring on his harness, and he got his combat blade free and swung. Cade ducked under the arc, stepped inside, and drove her knife up under his arm where the ribs met the spine. He shuddered once and dropped. She moved to the next emplacement. The Vethrani there had heard the shots and were turning, their crests flat, their eyes wide, and she realized that they had not expected a human inside the building. They had been focused outward, on the threat they could see, and the idea that a single soldier would infiltrate a position held by 22 combatants through a collapsed building and a narrow alley under fire was not something their tactical models accounted for. Their tactical models did not account for humans at all. Cade cleared the second emplacement with 3 shots and a grenade she'd taken from the first dead gunner, a Vethrani concussive device that detonated with a flat, percussive thump and sent the 2 surviving crew members sprawling. She finished them with her sidearm. Below in the central hall, the Vethrani officer was shouting commands. She could hear the translator catching fragments. Second level compromised, single combatant human. It's the human redeploy, redeploy. She looked down at the hall from the gallery railing. The officer was looking up at her, 20 meters of vertical distance. His crest was fully erect, every spine extended, and his mouth was open in the expression that the Vethrani made when they confronted something that violated their understanding of how the galaxy worked. She didn't give him time to process it. Volkov East Wing now. The east wall of the hall blew inward as Volkov detonated a breaching charge on whatever access point he'd found in the utility tunnels. Hassari came through the breach first, firing, and Volkov followed, his automatic weapon sweeping the right flank of the hall. The Vethrani formation broke. Not all at once, they were too disciplined for that, but in sections, as soldiers caught between fire from the gallery above and the breach to the east tried to reorient, and found that there was no orientation that didn't leave them exposed to one or the other. They fell back toward the central platform, closing ranks around their officer, and for a moment the formation held. Cade jumped from the gallery. It was a 20-foot drop. She landed on one of the heavy stone tables that flanked the dais, and the impact drove her to one knee, and the Vethrani soldier nearest to her flinched backward so hard that he stumbled into the soldier behind him. She rose from the crouch with her sidearm level and put a round through the flinching soldier's weapon, shattering it in his hands. The hall went very still. It lasted less than a second, that stillness, but it was enough. Enough for every Vethrani in the room to see her, this human, this small, battered, dust-covered creature with a cracked shoulder plate and dried blood on her collar and eyes that held no rage, no hatred, no visible emotion at all except a flat, steady attention that was worse than anger because anger could be understood. Anger was a thing that burned out. What was in Cade's eyes did not burn out. Then the second ended, and she moved again. The fighting in the hall took 4 minutes. Cade didn't track it by time, she tracked it by ammunition. 2 cells expended, 14 rounds from the sidearm, each one placed. Her knife came out twice. She took a hit to her right thigh from a Vethrani sidearm, a grazing shot that burned through the fabric of her fatigues and left a stripe of charred skin that would scar if she lived long enough for it to heal. When it was over, Volkov and Hassari held the east side of the hall, and Cade stood on the dais next to the Vethrani officer, who was on his knees with his one functional arm raised. The central compound was theirs. Cade walked the perimeter while Volkov secured the prisoners, 3 Vethrani survivors, all wounded, all disarmed. The compound was larger than she had expected from the exterior. The central hall branched into 6 subsidiary corridors, each feeding into chambers that had served various administrative functions before the garrison had converted them. One had been an armory, now mostly emptied but still containing racks of maintenance tools and a crate of plasma cells that hadn't been distributed. Cade stacked the cells in the central hall and began testing each one against her sidearm's interface port. 7 compatible, 11 incompatible but potentially modifiable. She set those aside for Hassari. Another chamber had been a communications center. The equipment was Vethrani standard issue bulky, built for reliability rather than elegance, and most of it was still functional. The displays showed feeds from exterior sensor nodes that covered the approaches to the compound, and through one of the feeds Cade got her first clear look at the eastern barracks. It sat 300 meters east, across an open stretch of rubble-strewn ground that had once been a municipal plaza. The barracks itself was a squat, heavy structure with reinforced walls and narrow firing slits on 2 levels. She could see movement through the slits, soldiers repositioning, the occasional flash of a plasma projector's barrel being adjusted. They knew the compound had fallen. They were preparing. She counted the firing slits, 14 on the ground level, 8 on the upper, 22 potential weapon positions. The approach across the plaza offered no cover worth the name, just scattered chunks of masonry and a dry decorative channel that might have been a fountain once. A frontal assault across that ground would be precisely the kind of engagement the Vethrani's doctrine was built for. An exposed enemy moving across open terrain into prepared defenses. Cade studied the feeds for 5 minutes. Then she pulled up the compound's architectural overlay, a building schematic embedded in the facility's local network, which Hassari had unlocked in under 90 seconds by brute forcing the access codes with a technique she developed specifically for Vethrani encryption. The overlay showed the utility infrastructure connecting the compound to the barracks, a buried conduit for power, a drainage system, and a maintenance corridor that ran underground between the 2 buildings. The maintenance corridor had been sealed at the barracks end. Cade noted the seal type, a standard Vethrani pressure door with a mechanical lock, nothing that a breaching charge couldn't open. She filed that information and continued her assessment. The compound's water system, as she noted, was still operational. The filtration unit was housed in the basement level, a compact Vethrani design that processed atmospheric moisture and stored it in a pressurized tank. She checked the tank level, 82%. More than enough for 6 humans for a week, if it came to that. She checked the building's structural integrity. Next, damage reports from the sensor grid showed significant exterior degradation on the north and west faces, but the core load-bearing members were intact. The building would hold. She returned to the central hall and found Hassari already working on the comm array, stripping panels with the focused intensity of someone who understood that communications were the difference between a squad and an afterthought. Len and Torsen had set up a basic defensive position at the hall's main entrance, the scavenged projector aimed down the primary approach corridor. Cade sat down next to the Vethrani officer. He hadn't moved from where she'd left him kneeling on the stone floor, his injured arm cradled against his chest, his crest still pressed flat. Cade looked down at the officer. His crest was flat against his skull, pressed so tight it looked like it was trying to retract into the bone. The translator caught his breathing rapid, shallow, the Vethrani equivalent of hyperventilation. "How many more in the outer compound?" she asked. He stared at her. The translator rendered his response, 31 Eastern Barracks. "Reinforcements incoming. The interdiction fleet controls the corridor. Your people cannot reach you." "I didn't ask about my people. I asked about yours." He paused. The question seemed to confuse him, as though the concept of a besieged force asking about the enemy's reinforcements rather than its own rescue was something that did not fit into his framework. A relief column, 2 days, maybe 3. Good. Cade sat down on the edge of the dais, her legs hanging over the side, and began reloading her sidearm. Her movements were steady and unhurried, the same movements she had made 10,000 times in training and 2,000 times in combat, and she did not look at the officer while she did it. "That gives us time." "Time for what?" Cade looked at him. She clicked the fresh cell into place with a small, precise motion and rested the weapon on her knee. "To take the barracks." The officer's crest fluttered a rapid, involuntary spasm that the xenobiology files classified as the Vethrani distress response. "You have 7 soldiers." 6, her voice was level. "Drennick died this morning." 6 soldiers, against 31 in a fortified position. "We just took your compound with 7 against 28. 6 against 31 is an improvement." He stared at her. She watched his expression shift through something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite awe, and lived in the territory between them, where a mind was being forced to reorganize its fundamental categories. He had fought 9 species across 4 decades of colonial service. He had won most of those fights. He had never lost a fortified position to an inferior force. He had never fought humans. "Why won't you stop?" he said. The translator rendered it flat, without inflection, but Cade could hear the original Vethrani beneath it, a hoarse, guttural sound that carried the weight of 11 days of watching something he could not explain. She considered the question. It deserved an honest answer, she decided, because the officer had given her honest intelligence, and because he was wounded and disarmed and had stopped fighting, and there was a form of respect in that. "Because this is what we do," she said. "This is what we've always done. We get hit and we get up. We lose people and we keep going. Not because we don't feel it, we feel all of it. The dead, the tired, the pain, we carry every bit of it, but we carry it forward." She paused. The hall was quiet. Volkov and Hassari had finished securing the perimeter, and Len and Torsen had moved up from the barricade and were clearing the ground floor. The only sound was the faint hiss of cooling plasma burns on the stone walls, and the distant thud of the interdiction, fleet's patrol craft passing overhead. "Your models say we should have stopped on day 3, Cade said. Day 3 was when Brusick died. She was my corporal, 12 years together. I carried her tags for the rest of that day, and that night I hit your supply depot on the South Ridge and burned it out. Not because I was angry, because the mission was still the mission, and stopping meant her death didn't count for anything. The officer said nothing. His crest had gone completely flat, and his eyes, large, amber, slitted like a cat's, were fixed on her, with an expression that the translator couldn't render because the Vethrani didn't have a word for it. Cade stood up. The movement pulled at her shoulder wound, and the new burn on her thigh and the bruised ribs, and the 11 accumulated days of damage that her body was carrying like a ledger of costs she would pay later, if there was a later. She didn't wince. "You can tell your relief column what happened here," she said. "You can tell them exactly how many of us there are, and what weapons we're carrying and how long we've been fighting. Tell them all of it. It won't change anything." "Why?" "Because they'll come anyway, and so will we." She turned to the hall. Her squad was assembling on the ground floor, 6 soldiers, battered, undersupplied, 3 of them carrying wounds they hadn't bothered to report, because reporting them would have taken time they didn't have. Torsen was helping Len reposition the scavenged plasma projector. Volkov was sorting Vethrani ammunition cells by compatibility with human weapons. Hassari was already working on the building's comm array, her fingers moving with quick precision as she stripped the housing and began rerouting the signal architecture. "Hassari, can you get a signal through the interdiction screen?" "Not a broadband, but I can bounce a tight beam off the orbital debris. Low bandwidth, enough for text." "Send this, Dresh-Ka Eastern Compound secured, 6 effectives, proceeding to Barracks Complex. No resupply required." Hassari looked at her. "No resupply required." "They can't get it through anyway. No point asking for what won't come. But when Fleet Command reads that we're still advancing without support, they'll know what we are." "And what are we?" Cade looked at her squad. 6 humans standing in the wreckage of a position that should have held against 10 times their number, their faces lined with dust and fatigue, and the particular expression that came from crossing the boundary where the body's limits lived, and finding that there was still ground on the other side. "We're the line," she said. Hassari sent the message. The Vethrani relief column arrived not in 2 days but in 1. A fast march force of 80 soldiers with armored transport and close air support that screamed in over the ridgeline at dawn and hit the eastern compound with everything they had before the sun cleared the horizon. By noon, they had lost 17 soldiers, 2 transports, and any belief that numbers alone would settle this. Cade had prepared the compound through the night. She had turned the Vethrani's own fortifications against them, repositioned the captured emitters to cover the northern and western approaches, mined the service alley with improvised charges built from Vethrani demolition stock, and set up interlocking fields of fire from the second-level galleries that turned the central hall into a kill box. She had also rigged the collapsed secondary building with a deadfall trap that dropped 3 tons of masonry onto the first Vethrani assault team to push through it. The relief column's commanding officer attempted a coordinated 3-axis assault at 700. By 7:30, 2 axes had stalled, and the third had retreated after losing its forward element to Volkov and Hassari's ambush in the drainage tunnel. At 800, the officer tried a flanking maneuver through the west service path. Cade met it personally, at the narrowest point of the alley, and held the choke for 90 seconds with her sidearm and 2 fragmentation charges until the flanking force pulled back. 90 seconds, 5 Vethrani soldiers, 1 human with a bad shoulder and a worse temper, though temper was the wrong word because Cade didn't lose her temper. She didn't have a temper anymore. She had a condition, and the condition was that she did not stop. By 1,000, the relief column's commander requested communication. Cade walked out to meet him under a white marker that the Vethrani used for parley, a strip of pale fabric hung from a pole, visible against the bright morning sky. The commander was tall, even for a Vethrani, with a crest that had been clipped short in the military style, and he wore the heavy command harness of a field-grade officer. He looked at Cade with the same expression she had seen on the compound officer's face, the expression of a professional soldier confronting something that his training had not prepared him for. "I am Commander Dresh-Ka," he said through the translator, "4th Colonial Relief. Sergeant Marin Cade, Terran Expeditionary. You hold this position with 6 soldiers." "I hold this position." He studied her. She could see him cataloging the damage, the cracked shoulder plate, the burned thigh, the dust and dried blood, the way she stood with her weight slightly off her right leg to compensate for the wound. She could see him running the calculation. This creature is damaged, outnumbered, cut off from support. By every standard his species understood, she should be requesting terms. "My garrison commander tells me you have fought for 12 days without resupply." 12 days, that's correct. He says you attacked his fortified compound with 7 soldiers and took it in under an hour. The compound, yes. The barracks were still working on. Your timing wasn't ideal. Sohol's crest twitched. How are you still functional? It was the same question the compound officer had asked. Cade gave it the same weight because it deserved the same honest answer, and because she understood now that this question was the most important thing happening on this battlefield. Not the guns, not the positions, not the tactical situation. This question. "Commander, your species fights well. You're disciplined, you're tough, and you don't give up easily. I respect that. But you fight based on what your models tell you is possible, and your models are wrong." "Wrong how?" "They tell you we should be dead. They tell you a species this size, with this metabolic load, operating on this little sleep and this much damage, should have collapsed days ago. And by any model you've built from any species you've ever fought, that's a reasonable prediction." She paused. The morning light was warm on her face, and she could hear the distant sound of her squad working in the compound behind her, the clank of repositioned equipment, the murmur of voices, the steady small sounds of humans preparing for the next fight. "But you built those models from species that evolved to avoid their predators. You built them from species that survived by being faster or harder to catch or better at hiding. We didn't evolve that way. On our world, the predators didn't stop. They followed you for days. They waited at the water. They came back after you drove them off. So we became the species that doesn't stop either, not because we're stronger or faster, because we decided 1,000,000 years ago that we would rather die on our feet than live on the run." Sohel said nothing for a long time. When he spoke, the translator rendered his voice as flat and affectless, but Cade could hear the Vethrani original beneath it, and what she heard was something that had traveled past confusion and past alarm and had arrived, finally, at a kind of recognition. "You will not accept terms." "No. You will continue to attack, regardless of casualties, regardless of supply, regardless of how many soldiers I bring against your position." "Yes. And if I destroy this compound and kill every one of your soldiers and burn this position to the foundation stone?" Cade looked at him. The morning sun was behind her, and she knew what he saw: a small human woman, barely past 30 standard years, standing in battered armor with a sidearm on her hip and a knife on her belt, and nothing in her eyes that suggested she was bluffing. "Then you'll have a very quiet afternoon," she said. "But you should know something, Commander. There are more of us. There are always more of us. And every one of them is exactly like me." Sohel held her gaze for a count of 5. Then his crest lowered slowly, not in aggression, not in submission, but in the Vethrani gesture that Cade had never seen directed at a human before. It was the crest dip of acknowledgement between equals, between soldiers who understood what the other was. He turned and walked back to his line. The fighting resumed at 1400 hours. Sohul opened with the close air support 2 patrol craft that swept in low over the compound. Their belly-mounted plasma batteries raking the second-level galleries with a sustained barrage that turned the stone railings into shrapnel and forced Cade's people off the emitters for the first time since they'd captured the position. While the gallery crews were down, 3 Vethrani assault columns advanced simultaneously north, west, and through the drainage tunnel that Volkov had used the day before. It was good. It was disciplined, well-timed, and it exploited the one vulnerability Cade hadn't been able to close. The compound had too many entry points for 6 soldiers to cover simultaneously. Cade had anticipated this. She had spent the night reorganizing the defense on a rotating principle she'd learned from an instructor at Ridgeline Station, a woman named Vasquez who'd fought the Calori incursion and who had a saying that Cade still carried. If you can't cover everything, cover what matters. Make them pay for the rest. What mattered was the central hall, because the central hall controlled the building's interior sight lines and gave elevation over every approach. Everything else was expendable. Len, pull off the north gallery, fall back to the hall, bring the projector. They'll take the north wing. Let them, Volkov, collapse the drainage tunnel, use the last structural charge. She heard the detonation through the stone floor, a deep, grinding crunch as the tunnel ceiling came down. That sealed the third axis permanently. Sohul now had 2 approaches instead of 3, and neither gave him covered access to the interior. The patrol craft came around for a second pass. Cade watched from the west gallery as the green bolts hammered the building's facade, blowing chunks of masonry into the courtyard below. One bolt struck close enough to her position to crack the wall she was using for cover, and a shard of stone opened a cut above her left eye that bled freely down the side of her face. She wiped it with the back of her hand and kept watching. The northern assault column hit the north wing and found it empty. She could hear them clearing rooms below, the heavy footsteps and barked commands of soldiers who expected resistance and weren't finding any. They would reach the central hall in minutes, and when they did, they would find Len waiting with the scavenged projector positioned at the top of the gallery stairs, a choke point barely 2 meters wide, where the Vethrani's numerical advantage meant nothing. The western column was Sohul's main effort. 40 soldiers, armored, pushing through the service alley and the collapsed secondary building that Cade had used to infiltrate the compound the day before. They had cleared the deadfall trap debris and widened the approach, and they came in heavy and fast. Cade met them at the west breach. She didn't try to hold it. The math was wrong for that 1 human against 40 Vethrani in a direct engagement was a losing proposition even by her standards. Instead, she used the breach as a funnel, positioning herself on the interior side of the collapsed wall, where the rubble created a natural bottleneck that forced the Vethrani to enter 2 abreast instead of their preferred 6-wide assault formation. She fired from cover, dropping the lead pair, then fell back 10 meters to the next piece of cover, a collapsed interior wall, and fired again. Fall back, fire. Fall back, fire. Each position bought her 15 to 20 seconds, and each position cost the Vethrani 2 to 4 soldiers, because they were big enough that they couldn't maneuver quickly in the confined space, and their plasma weapons took a full second to cycle between shots while her sidearm recycled in a quarter of that. Fighting retreat. A tactic as old as warfare itself, and one that humans had perfected over millennia of practice against predators, against enemies, against the fundamental condition of being a species that was never the strongest thing on the field but was always the hardest to finish. She fell back through 7 positions in 4 minutes, and by the time the western column reached the central hall, they had lost 11 soldiers, and their assault momentum had been bled out like heat from an opened airlock. They hit the hall anyway. The Vethrani were not cowards. But the hall was the kill box Cade had designed it to be. Volkov was on the east gallery with overlapping fire lanes. Hassari had rigged 3 scavenged Vethrani concussive charges as command-detonated mines along the ground floor approaches, and Len's projector covered the main stairwell from the north gallery like a turret, its barrel glowing with residual heat from the engagement at the north wing choke point. The western column entered the hall. Hassari triggered the first mine. The concussion blew the lead element sideways into the wall, and Volkov opened fire from the gallery before they could recover. The second wave pushed through their fallen and got 3 meters further before hitting the second mine. The third wave made it to the base of the dais stairs, close enough for Cade to see the individual scales on the point soldier's face, close enough to see his crest go flat as he looked up and saw a human looking down at him from the gallery rail with the same expression she'd worn for 13 days, calm, attentive, utterly without panic. She shot him. She shot the soldier behind him. The column broke. They retreated through the breach in good order, falling back by fire team, covering each other, the way trained soldiers retreated when the fight went against them. Cade respected it. She did not pursue. Pursuit with 6 soldiers against a force that still outnumbered them 5-1 was overreach, and Cade had survived 13 days by knowing exactly where the line between aggression and recklessness lived. The north wing column hit the gallery choke point 2 minutes later and stalled against Len's projector. The engagement lasted 90 seconds. 7 Vethrani tried to push through the 2-meter gap. 3 made it to the other side. None of them made it past Len. By 1600, both columns had withdrawn to the courtyard. By 1630, Sohel pulled them back to the perimeter line. Cade used the lull to redistribute ammunition. They were running critically low on human-compatible cells, 4 left, total, across the entire squad. But they had accumulated a substantial stock of Vethrani weapons and power cells from the dead, and Hassari had developed a field modification that allowed the alien cells to interface with human sidearms at roughly 60% efficiency. The shots were weaker and the weapons ran hotter, but they fired. Good enough. Torsen, how many charges do we have left? The private checked his tally. He had started keeping meticulous records sometime around day 11, a coping mechanism that Cade recognized from her own early deployments, the brain seeking order in chaos. 2 fragmentation, 1 breaching, 4 Vethrani concussive, but 2 of those are duds. Hassari says she can maybe reactivate. She can reactivate them or she can't. Ask her. She says 70-30. Good enough. Stack everything on the north wing approach. If they come again tonight, that's where they'll push. Sohel came again at dusk. This time he didn't use the columns. He sent the patrol craft in alone low, fast, targeting the galleries with precision fire designed to suppress the emitters and force the humans to ground level. While the craft made their runs, a single Vethrani demolition team worked its way to the compound's western wall under cover of the bombardment, and placed a shaped charge that blew a 3-meter hole in the wall at ground level. Cade heard the detonation and felt the building shudder. Stone dust rained from the ceiling of the central hall. West wall breach, Volkov reported. Big one. They'll fit a full squad through that. How many coming? Thermals show 12 moving fast. These aren't regular garrison. Combat harnesses are different, heavier plating, shorter crests, assault specialists. Elite troops, Sohel's reserve. Cade pulled Len off the north gallery and repositioned him at the west breach, projector and all. She took Torsen and moved to the upper level, where the blown wall had opened a sight line from the second-floor corridor down into the breach area. The assault specialists hit the breach at speed. They were faster than the regular garrison troops, leaner, more aggressive, their movements coordinated with a precision that spoke of years of training together. The point element came through the gap already firing, suppressing Len's position with a volume of plasma that turned the air blue-green and forced him to pull back from the projector or lose his face. Cade fired down from the corridor. 3 shots, 3 hits, but the assault specialist armor was heavier than standard, and the modified Vethrani cells didn't deliver enough energy to penetrate at this angle. The bolt scorched and cracked the plating but didn't punch through. The lead specialist looked up, found her position, and put a burst through the corridor floor that blew a hole the size of a dinner plate 2 meters from her feet. She moved. Torson moved with her, firing as he went, not accurately, but steadily, the kind of suppressive fire that kept heads down even when it didn't hit anything. Good instinct. The kid was learning. Cade dropped through a utility hatch in the corridor floor, a maintenance access she'd mapped during the night, and came out in a storage room on the ground level, behind the assault team's advance. She could hear them in the corridor ahead, calling positions to each other in clipped Vethrani tactical shorthand. She had 2 fragmentation charges left. She used one. The blast in the confined corridor was devastating. The concussion alone knocked 3 specialists off their feet, and the shrapnel ceramic fragments designed to defeat personal armor at close range punched through the lighter sections of their harnesses at the joints and seams. Cade came around the corner while they were still down, sidearm up, and fired into the disoriented cluster with the methodical, practiced rhythm of someone who had done this too many times to count. 4 down, 3 scrambling back toward the breach, 5 unaccounted for deeper in the building. Volkov 5 specialists in the east wing, moving your direction. I see them. Hassari covering fire. She heard the exchange, the sharp crack of Hassari's marksman rifle, the heavier thump of Volkov's automatic weapon, the crash of a Vethrani body hitting stone. Cade cleared the corridor. She moved through the wreckage of the blast, stepping over bodies, checking corners, and found the last specialist crouched behind a collapsed beam at the far end of the hall. He was wounded shrapnel in his left leg, green blood seeping through the fabric of his combat harness, and he had his weapon raised but not aimed. He was looking at her. Cade stopped, 3 meters between them, close enough to read the fine detail of his face, the heavy, ridge-browed skull, the amber eyes, the short-clipped crest that marked him as career military. He was older than most of the soldiers she'd fought here, experienced. He had the look of someone who had seen enough of war to recognize what he was looking at. "You can put it down," she said. He held the weapon for another 2 seconds, then he set it on the ground. Cade zip-tied his wrists. She offered him water from her canteen, and he took it, drinking with the careful, efficient motions of a soldier who knew the value of hydration. He didn't speak. She didn't make him. By 2000, the breach assault was over. Sohel's elite team was gone, dead, captured, or driven back through the wall breach that Volkov subsequently collapsed with their own shaped charge, sealing the western approach for good. At 2100 hours, Sohel pulled his remaining forces back to a perimeter line 300 meters from the compound. At 2130, Hassari intercepted a transmission from his comm array. The translator rendered it as a priority dispatch to Vethrani Colonial Command, requesting immediate strategic review of human engagement protocols. Current force projections are inadequate. Repeat, current force projections are inadequate. Single human squad has held fortified position for 13 standard days against sustained opposition. Recommend reclassification of human threat assessment from Category 4 to Category 1. They do not degrade. They do not stop. Conventional doctrine does not apply. Cade listened to the translation, standing in the compound's central hall with her squad around her. The hall was battered, the stone walls pitted with blast marks, the floor littered with debris and spent cells and the detritus of 2 days of fighting. The Vethrani ceremonial carvings on the walls had been mostly obliterated by weapons fire, but one panel remained intact near the east breach, a carved depiction of what looked like a Vethrani warrior standing over a defeated enemy, crest raised, victorious. Cade looked at it for a moment, then she turned to the work. "Casualty report," she said. Volkov answered. Hassari took a graze across her back, shallow, still mobile. I've got shrapnel in my left forearm, pulled what I could. Len's fine, Torson's fine. You. Functional. Functional. The word that had replaced every other adjective in the squad's vocabulary. Not fine, not good, not ready, functional. It meant the same thing it had meant every day since the landing. The body works, the weapon fires, the mind holds. Anything beyond that was a luxury they'd stopped requesting. Cade walked the perimeter of the hall, checking the defensive positions that had held during the assault. The captured Vethrani emitters on the second-level gallery were scorched and battered, but still operational. Hassari's field repairs had kept them running past their failure point through a combination of engineering skill and what Volkov called threatening them in the right language. The barricades at the ground floor entrances were solid. The east breach had been reinforced with rubble from the interior demolition, and Volkov had rigged a tripwire alarm across it using salvaged sensor wire. She counted ammunition. The squad's total inventory after the day's fighting: 11 human-compatible sidearm cells, 5 of them Hassari's modified Vethrani cells, operating at 60% efficiency, 3 Vethrani plasma projector power units for the scavenged weapon, 1 fragmentation charge, 2 Vethrani concussive charges of dubious reliability, 47 rounds of kinetic ammunition for Volkov's automatic weapon, and whatever Hassari could improvise from the spare parts scattered across the compound. Not much, enough. Enough had been the standard since day 4. Cade sat down on the dais steps and pulled a Vethrani ration pack from her belt. She peeled it open and began to eat. The ration tasted like wet chalk mixed with something vaguely mineral that she couldn't identify and didn't want to. She chewed it anyway, because calories were ammunition for the body, and she treated them with the same economy she applied to everything else. While she ate, she thought about the barracks. The architectural overlay from the communications center had shown her the maintenance corridor, the underground passage that connected the compound to the barracks complex. It was sealed at the far end, but Hassari could breach that seal. The corridor would bypass the open plaza entirely, putting her inside the barracks perimeter before the garrison knew she was coming. But the corridor was a bottleneck. If the Vethrani had any intelligence about it, and they might, since it was their own building, they could trap her inside it. She needed a distraction, something that would pull the barracks garrison's attention to the surface approaches while the real assault came from below. The scavenged plasma projector. Len could operate it from the compound's upper gallery, firing across the plaza at the barracks' firing slits. It wouldn't penetrate the barracks walls, but it would force the defenders to man their positions and focus outward. While they were focused outward, Cade and Volkov would come through the floor. It was not a good plan. Good plans required numbers, supplies, and margins of error. What it was sufficient. It addressed the problem, it used the resources available, and it acknowledged the reality that no plan survives contact with the enemy by being simple enough to work when everything went wrong. Cade finished the ration. She looked at the Vethrani carving on the wall, the warrior standing victorious over the fallen, and she felt nothing particular about it. Victory was not the point. The point was the next step, and the step after that, and the step after that, until there were no more steps to take or no more ground to take them on. Torson sat down next to her. He was carrying 2 canteens, his own, and one he'd filled from the compound's filtration system. He offered her one. She took it and drank. The water was clean, slightly mineralized by the Vethrani filtration process, and it was the best thing she'd tasted in 13 days. "Sergeant," he said. His voice was quiet, not out of fear, but out of the particular reverence that settled over soldiers in the aftermath of a fight they should not have survived. "The captured specialist, the one you took alive at the breach, he won't stop staring at me. He's trying to figure out how old you are." "Why does that matter?" "Because you're 22, and you just survived an assault by his unit's elite tier, and his species doesn't send soldiers into the field until they're the equivalent of 35. He's recalibrating. Torsen processed that. Recalibrating what? Everything he thought he knew about us. They sat in silence for a while. The compound settled around them, the building creaking softly as thermal stress from the day's weapons fire worked through the stone. Outside, the Vethrani perimeter lights had come on a ring of cold blue markers that glowed against the darkening sky, defining the boundary between Sohol's force and the compound that 6 humans held. "Do you think they'll come again tomorrow?" Torsen asked. "Yes," Cade said. "And the barracks, are we really going for it?" "Tonight, 300, while Sohol's perimeter is set for defense, not for watching us move." Torsen's eyes widened slightly, but he didn't flinch. Something had changed in him over the last 2 days, the raw material of training and youth hardening into something more durable under the sustained heat of combat. He was becoming the thing that the Vethrani's models couldn't account for, a human who had been pushed past every limit the models predicted, and had found on the other side that there was still capacity remaining. "What do you need me to do?" he asked. "Stay on the projector with Len. When I give the signal, hit the barracks with everything the cell has left. Then switch to Volkov's automatic and keep firing. I don't care if you hit anything. I care that they're looking at you. And you'll be underground. Me and Volkov. Hassari stays here to run comms and the sensors. You, Len, and the projector are the show. Make it loud." Torsen nodded. The fear was still there in his face, visible in the tightness around his jaw and the way his hands rested on his knees with just slightly too much pressure. But layered over the fear was something else, the same quality that Cade had seen in every soldier who crossed the line between fighting because they were ordered to and fighting because they understood in their bones why it mattered. "We hold the line," he said. It wasn't a question. Cade recognized the tone. It was the tone of a man who had arrived at the floor. She'd found the solid ground underneath the exhaustion and the fear and the arithmetic of losses, and had planted his feet on it. "We hold the line," she confirmed. She stood up. The movement pulled at every wound and bruise and strained muscle, and she acknowledged each one with the same dispassionate attention she gave to equipment status noted, cataloged, filed under things that matter but do not change the mission. She looked at her squad. 5 soldiers, Volkov already checking the breaching charge, Hassari running diagnostics on the comm relay, Len asleep against the projector with the disciplined unconsciousness of a veteran who could drop into rest the way, a machine dropped into standby mode, Torsen organizing ammunition cells by charge level. 5 humans in a stone building on an alien world, 13 days into a fight that should have ended in 3. She thought about Brusik, about Drenik, about the 7 soldiers who had landed here 2 weeks ago and the 6 who were still standing. She carried them not as ghosts, not as guilt, but as weight. The honest, physical weight of people she had been responsible for, people who had trusted her judgment with their lives and had paid the price of that trust. She carried them forward because forward was the only direction that honored what they'd spent. "Rest until 200, she said. "Full gear at 230, we go at 300. Nobody argued. Nobody asked the odds. They were past odds. They were past the place where numbers determined outcomes and had entered the territory where the only variable that mattered was whether you were willing to get up one more time than the enemy expected you to. The Vethrani expected them to sleep through the night, lick their wounds, and prepare for a defensive engagement the following morning. It was a reasonable expectation, built on reasonable models, supported by the behavior of every species the Vethrani had ever fought. Cade's squad was not every species. She sat against the dais wall and closed her eyes. 90 minutes. Then she would open them and she would stand up, and she would walk through the maintenance corridor into the barracks and do the one thing the Vethrani had not yet learned to expect from humans. She would keep going. The silence in the compound was not peace. It was the drawn breath before the next exhalation, the held beat before the next strike. 6 humans resting in a building they had taken from an enemy that outnumbered them 4-1, preparing to do it again in 6 hours with even less ammunition and even worse odds. Outside, Sohol's perimeter lights pulsed blue in the darkness, steady and regular, the heartbeat of a force that believed the night was theirs. Inside, Cade's heartbeat was slower, steadier, the resting pulse of a predator that did not need darkness to hunt, did not need numbers to win, did not need permission to advance. 90 minutes passed. She opened her eyes, she checked her weapon, she stood up. And she went forward again,